TWA Flight 800, 1996. One moment, everything was calm. The low hum of the engines, the quiet buzz of passengers settling in for their long trip across the Atlantic. And then, in a blink, that peaceful summer evening turned into one of aviation's darkest nights. TWA Flight 800, a Boeing 747 heading from New York to Paris, took off from JFK on July 17, 1996. It was meant to be a simple overnight flight to France, continuing later to Rome. Families, students, and business travelers are all just looking forward to landing in Europe by morning. The sky over Long Island was clear, the ocean below perfectly still. Everything seemed ordinary. But about 12 minutes after takeoff, as the jet climbed higher, witnesses on the ground saw something strange, like a flash, then a massive burst of fire. The plane had exploded in midair. The nose tore off, fiery debris rained into the Atlantic, and what was left of the aircraft spiraled down into the sea. 230 people were gone in seconds. What caused it? For years, theories flew. Some said it was a missile, others, a bomb. The FBI launched a massive investigation, chasing every lead. But when the National Transportation Safety Board finally wrapped up its years-long inquiry, the answer turned out to be less sinister and somehow even more tragic. A short circuit, they found, had likely caused a spark inside the center fuel tank. The vapors ignited, triggering a devastating explosion. It wasn't terrorism. It was a mechanical failure, an ordinary spark that destroyed an extraordinary machine and changed air safety forever. But this wasn't the first time tragedy had rewritten the rules of the skies for trans-world airlines. More than 2 decades earlier, another flight, TWA Flight 514, would fall victim to something far more unpredictable. TWA Flight 514, 1974. It was the Sunday after Thanksgiving in 1974. A cold and gray morning that was supposed to end with a simple landing in Washington, D.C. Instead, it became one of the most tragic days that would be remembered forever. TWA Flight 514 was a Boeing 727 traveling from Indianapolis to Washington with a stop in Columbus. The flight was meant to land at Washington National Airport, but heavy winds forced controllers to divert it to Dulles. On board were 92 people, families heading home and business travelers wrapping up the holiday weekend. Snow and low clouds filled the Virginia sky as the pilots began their descent. Everything still felt routine. Then came the confusion. Air traffic control cleared the flight for an approach to runway 12, but the message was not clear enough. The pilots believed they were under radar guidance and could descend safely. They were not. The crew began dropping to 1,800 feet, unaware that the hills around Mount Weather rose dangerously close beneath them. Within seconds, the Boeing struck the mountain. The left wing clipped the trees, the fuselage broke apart, and the wreckage scattered across the forest. Flames lit up the snow-covered hillside. All 92 people on board were lost instantly. When investigators studied the crash, they discovered the cause was a terrible misunderstanding. The wording between controllers and pilots had been unclear, leading both sides to assume different things. It was not sabotage or failure, but human communication gone wrong. The wreck of TWA Flight 514 would lead to new rules, new systems, and safer skies. Yet, even before that progress began, another TWA jet had already fallen from the sky, its fate far darker. This time, the cause wasn't fog or confusion. It was something silent, unseen, and intentional. TWA Flight 841, 1974. No one on board knew they had just stepped into a ticking time bomb disguised as an ordinary flight. On September 8, 1974, TWA Flight 841, a Boeing 707, took off from Athens on its way to Rome, part of a long journey from Tel Aviv to New York. The passengers were a mix of tourists, families, and business travelers ready for the next stop. The sky over the Ionian Sea was clear, the air smooth. Everything looked perfectly normal. Then, in the middle of that calm climb, disaster struck. Without any warning, the aircraft suddenly jerked upward. Witnesses in another plane nearby watched in horror as the Boeing twisted violently, pieces breaking away in midair. Within seconds, it went into a deadly dive, spiraling toward the sea. There was no mayday call, no clue of what went wrong. The plane hit the water with incredible force, scattering debris across the waves. All 88 people on board were lost. At first, investigators were puzzled. The weather was fine, the crew experienced, the jet in good shape. But when experts examined the wreckage, the story began to change. They found signs of an explosion in the cargo hold and traces of explosive chemicals. It wasn't a malfunction at all. It was a bomb. The person who planted it was never officially identified, but the incident sent shockwaves through the aviation world. It led to tighter airport security and better baggage screening, forever changing how airlines handled cargo. TWA Flight 841 became a haunting reminder that sometimes the real danger isn't in the sky, it's hidden deep within the plane itself. TWA Flight 529, 1961. It was the first morning of September in 1961, and for the passengers of TWA Flight 529, it was supposed to be just another trip across the country. The aircraft was a Lockheed Constellation, one of the most elegant airliners of its time. It had already flown from Boston to Chicago and was now preparing for its next leg toward Las Vegas before continuing to California. On board were 78 people, including business travelers, families, and crew, all expecting a smooth flight west. After takeoff from Chicago's Midway Airport, everything seemed normal. The plane climbed steadily into the gray Illinois sky. Then, within minutes, something went terribly wrong. The aircraft suddenly pitched sharply upward, far steeper than normal. Passengers would have felt a jolt, maybe heard loose items crash around the cabin. Moments later, the nose dropped violently, and the plane began to dive. The pilots fought desperately for control, but it was too late. The Constellation slammed into a field near Hinsdale, Illinois, breaking apart on impact and erupting in flames. No one survived. When investigators arrived, they faced a grim scene and a mystery. The weather was clear, and the crew was experienced. What could have caused such a sudden loss of control? After weeks of examining the wreckage, experts discovered the heartbreaking truth. A single small bolt, no bigger than a pencil eraser, was missing from the elevator control system. Without it, the pilots had no real control over the plane's pitch. That tiny missing bolt led to one of the worst single aircraft crashes in U.S. history. The investigation brought new safety standards for aircraft design, ensuring backup systems and better maintenance inspections. TWA Flight 2, 1956. What if two routine departures from Los Angeles were flying peacefully, and then, in an instant, became one of aviation's darkest chapters? On June 30th, 1956, TWA Flight 2, a sleek Lockheed Super Constellation, lifted off from Los Angeles bound for Kansas City. It carried 64 passengers and 6 crew members. The weather was mostly clear, the kind of day pilots dream about. At nearly the same time, United Airlines Flight 718, a Douglas DC-7 heading to Chicago, left Los Angeles on a similar route. Both planes climbed to cruising altitude over Arizona. Since this was before radar covered every part of the country, pilots relied on sight and radio updates to keep safe distances. TWA Flight 2 requested to fly 1,000 on top, meaning just above the clouds. It was a normal move, but it placed the aircraft in an area where air traffic controllers had limited oversight. Over the Grand Canyon, two powerful airliners found themselves converging at the same altitude. In the vast blue sky, neither crew saw the other in time. The United DC-7's wing sliced into the TWA Constellation's tail. Both aircraft spiraled helplessly toward the canyon below. The Constellation hit first, shattering on impact. Moments later, the DC-7 crashed a mile away. All 128 people aboard both planes were killed. The investigation revealed the tragedy was caused by limited air traffic control and the simple failure of two crews to see each other soon enough. But this disaster changed aviation forever. It led to the creation of the Federal Aviation Administration, expanded radar systems, and stricter rules separating aircraft in flight. TWA Flight 128, 1967. On the cold night of November 20th, 1967, TWA Flight 128 began its final approach to Cincinnati, its passengers unaware they were moments away from tragedy. The aircraft, a sleek Convair 880, had taken off from Los Angeles earlier that day, making its way east with planned stops in Cincinnati and Pittsburgh before heading to Boston. On board were 82 people expecting to land safely and rest before continuing their journeys. As the plane neared Cincinnati's Greater Cincinnati Airport, the weather began to turn. Snow flurries drifted across the dark sky, and visibility dropped. To make matters worse, some of the airport's key landing aids, like the glide slope and approach lights, weren't working. The pilots decided to continue with a visual approach, trusting their instruments and experience to guide them through the murky night. But in the darkness, with snow and clouds swirling around, depth and distance became deceptive. The pilots believed they were lined up correctly for the runway, but the plane had dropped lower than it should have. The Convair 880 skimmed dangerously close to the trees before its left wing clipped the top of one. In seconds, the massive jet tore through the woods, breaking apart and bursting into flames just over a mile from the runway. 70 people were killed instantly. Only 12 survived, pulled from the wreckage in the freezing night. When investigators studied what had happened, the findings were painful but clear. The crew had descended below the minimum safe altitude without realizing it. Poor visibility, lack of working navigation aids, and misleading terrain had all played a part. It was a crash that reminded the world how fragile precision could be when machines and nature collided. But nearly a decade earlier, another TWA flight had fallen victim to something far beyond human error. It was something untouchable, unpredictable, and electrifying. TWA Flight 891, 1959. It was the afternoon of June 26, 1959, when TWA Flight 891 lifted off from Milan, heading for Paris. The aircraft, a Lockheed Starliner, was one of the most advanced airliners of its time, built for long, elegant transatlantic journeys. On board were 68 people, including families, students, and business travelers, most of them on their way to connect with flights bound for the United States. The weather wasn't ideal. Thunderstorms were forming over northern Italy, but flights were still operating normally. After takeoff, the plane climbed steadily into the sky, disappearing into heavy clouds. It was only a few minutes into the flight when something went terribly wrong. Witnesses on the ground saw a bright flash in the sky, followed by pieces of the aircraft falling like fire through the clouds. The Starliner had broken apart in midair, scattering wreckage across the countryside near Olgete Olona, a small town northwest of Milan. Every single person on board was killed. When investigators arrived, they were met with a haunting scene. Twisted metal, scorched fields, and debris spread over miles. The weather had been stormy, but the real question was, what caused the explosion? Experts soon discovered the answer. Traces of lightning damage and explosive residue showed that a bolt of lightning had struck one of the aircraft's fuel tanks. The powerful charge had ignited fuel vapors, causing a chain of explosions that tore the plane apart in seconds. The tragedy of TWA Flight 891 pushed aviation engineers to rethink how airplanes were protected from lightning. New standards were developed for fuel tank venting and lightning shielding. The loss of that Starliner proved that even nature's invisible power could expose deadly weaknesses in man's most advanced machines. TWA Flight 903, 1950. On the night of August 31, 1950, TWA Flight 903 lifted off from Cairo, bound for Rome. The aircraft, a Lockheed Constellation known as the Star of Maryland, wasn't just on a short trip. It was part of a much longer journey that began in Bombay and was supposed to end in New York, with several stops in between. There were 55 people on board that night, expecting just another quiet overnight flight across the Mediterranean. But only a few minutes after takeoff, things started to go wrong. While climbing through the night sky, one of the 4 engines began to fail. The crew radioed that an engine had caught fire and immediately turned back toward Cairo, hoping they could make it in time for an emergency landing. The situation quickly got out of control. The flames spread across the wing, lighting up the darkness around the plane. Then came a terrifying moment. The burning engine tore completely free from the wing. With one side of the aircraft destroyed, the pilots lost control. The massive Constellation started losing altitude fast, heading down toward the desert below. The crew tried desperately to guide the plane down for a forced landing, but it struck the ground near the town of Itai El Baroud, about 65 miles from Cairo. The crash was violent, and the aircraft exploded upon impact. The wreckage scattered across the desert sands. Tragically, all 55 people on board lost their lives. When investigators examined what was left of the plane, they discovered the cause hidden deep inside the number 3 engine. A bearing had failed, creating extreme heat that caused metal parts to break apart. Oil leaked out, caught fire, and the entire engine came apart midair. That one small mechanical failure had led to a chain of events that destroyed the whole aircraft. TWA Flight 800, 1964. On November 23, 1964, TWA Flight 800 was ready to leave Rome for Athens, the next stop on its long trip from Kansas City to Cairo. On board were 73 people, passengers chatting softly, crew members running through final checks, and the engines humming as the plane lined up on the runway. The weather was good. The jet began its takeoff roll, accelerating fast along the pavement. Then, almost immediately, the pilots noticed something strange. One of the 4 engines wasn't producing power. They decided to abort the takeoff, slamming on the brakes and deploying the thrust reversers to slow the massive aircraft. But instead of slowing evenly, the Boeing suddenly pulled to one side. One of the reversers had failed. It wasn't slowing the plane at all. In fact, it was still pushing forward. The jet veered off the runway, raced across the end, and slammed into a construction vehicle. The right wing tore open and fuel began spilling out. Within seconds, flames engulfed the aircraft. Passengers tried desperately to escape, But then an explosion ripped through the fuel tank, sending a fireball through the cabin. Only 24 people made it out alive. Investigators later found that a disconnected pneumatic duct had caused the thrust reverser on one engine to malfunction, leaving it stuck in forward thrust even as the others reversed. That tiny mechanical issue and a vehicle crossing the runway combined to create disaster. The crash of TWA Flight 800 led to stronger safety checks on thrust reversers, tighter runway rules, and better fire protections.